Cut an earthworm in half, and for a few moments the result can look like proof of an old childhood story. Both pieces may twist. Both may react when touched. Put them on damp soil, and each fragment can seem alive. So did one worm just become two? Usually, no. An earthworm is not a biological photocopier, and it is not the same kind of animal as a planarian, the flatworm famous for rebuilding an entire body from small pieces. A damaged earthworm may regenerate some lost segments, but its body is not equally replaceable from end to end. In the common garden scenario, the front part has the better chance. The rear part usually dies. After a rough injury, both parts can die. The first useful clue is the thick, slightly swollen band near the front of an adult earthworm. That band is the clitellum, often called the saddle. It is mainly a reproductive organ. It helps produce the cocoon in which eggs develop. Garden advice sometimes treats it like a magical survival line. Cut behind the saddle and the front survives. Cut ahead of it and the worm dies. That rule is helpful, but it is still an oversimplification. A worm's head end contains much more than a mouth. Close behind it are the cerebral ganglia, the small cluster of nerve tissue often described as its brain. The front also contains the muscular pharynx that pulls in food, parts of the esophagus, the crop that stores material, the gizzard that grinds it, and several aortic arches that help pump blood through the body. The intestine continues for most of the worm's length, but many specialized organs are crowded toward the front. Now picture a spade slicing through the body, well behind the clitellum. The front fragment may keep the mouth, feeding apparatus, pumping structures, brain, clitellum, and a long section of intestine. It has lost a tail, but it still owns most of the equipment needed to remain an animal, rather than just a living piece of tissue. Under good conditions, it may close the wound and begin rebuilding posterior segments. The rear fragment has the opposite problem. It may still contain intestine, muscles, blood vessels, a ventral nerve cord, and many repeated segmental nerve centers. That is enough for movement. A touch can trigger contraction, and local circuits can produce wriggling without the front end being intact. This is why looking for motion is misleading. A tail fragment can move and still have no realistic route to long-term survival. No mouth means no new food. No pharynx means no way to pull material into the gut. Important anterior circulatory and nervous structures are gone. Even if the fragment seals its wound, it must do far more than grow a little tissue. It would need to rebuild a correctly organized head, mouth, nervous system, blood-pumping structures, and the front of the digestive tract. Most familiar earthworms cannot reliably do that after an ordinary mid-body cut. Some species complicate the story. Researchers study compost worms, such as Eisenia fetida, the African nightcrawler Eudrilus eugeniae, and Perionyx excavatus, because their regenerative abilities can be much stronger than those of many large garden earthworms. In particular laboratory conditions, some posterior fragments can regenerate anterior structures when enough of the correct segments remain. Cut position matters down to the segment. Age, maturity, temperature, moisture, and the species itself matter too. That means the sentence, "the back half always dies," is too absolute. The safer version is this. For the earthworms people commonly injure while gardening, the rear piece is far less likely to survive, while a sufficiently large front piece may regenerate a tail. There is no single rule covering thousands of earthworm species. Biology did not standardize the repair manual. The repair itself is not instant. First, the open end has to close. Cells spread across the wound, damaged material is cleared, and immune cells in the worm's body cavity respond. Then a pale mass of proliferating cells called a blastema can form. Cells in and around this region change their behavior, multiply, and begin producing new skin, muscle, nerves, blood vessels, gut tissue, and segment boundaries. Recent laboratory work on Eisenia andrae followed this process for weeks. The researchers described rapid wound closure, a developing blastema, rearrangement of epithelial and muscle cells, and nerve fibers extending from the last intact ganglion of the ventral nerve cord. The new end is not a tiny finished tail waiting to inflate. It is built step by step, with tissues having to reconnect in the right order. A thin, pale cap on a damaged worm is therefore not proof that recovery is guaranteed. It may be early wound closure. It may become a blastema. It may also stop developing. The fragment still has to maintain circulation, avoid infection, exchange gases through its skin, and find enough energy to rebuild. That sounds minor, but it matters. Earthworms breathe through moist skin. Oxygen dissolves in the film of moisture covering the body and diffuses into blood vessels near the surface. Leave an injured worm on a dry paving stone, and the breathing surface begins to fail. Put it in stagnant, oxygen-poor mud, and it can have the opposite problem. Damp, aerated soil is very different from a metal shovel, sunlight, and a patch of compacted clay. A garden cut is also rarely the neat operation used in a laboratory. A spade can crush several segments, tear the gut, squeeze out coelomic fluid, damage major blood vessels, and coat the wound with soil particles and microbes. The two ends may be jagged rather than clean. One fragment may be only a few centimeters long. The other may have the clitellum, but not enough healthy tissue behind it. And yes, this gets messy fast. If the gut ruptures, its contents can enter the body cavity. If too much fluid is lost before the muscles contract and the wound seals, circulation and internal pressure suffer. Earthworms use the fluid-filled spaces inside their segments as part of a hydrostatic skeleton. Muscles push against that fluid to change body shape and crawl. A severe open injury disrupts more than one organ at a time. The front piece can die even when the cut is behind the clitellum. It might lose too many posterior segments to maintain normal function. The wound may become infected. The animal may dry out before it burrows. Regeneration also costs energy, while the injured digestive system may not resume feeding quickly. A worm that survives the first hour has not necessarily survived the injury. The rear piece can fail for a simpler reason. It is running on what remains. Stored energy is finite. Movement continues for a while because muscles and local nerves still work. Eventually, without successful head regeneration and feeding, those reserves are used up. A moving fragment on the soil is not a second worm getting ready to crawl away. The clitellum adds another layer. In some studied species, keeping this region intact strongly improves survival and regeneration, and researchers have linked clitellar tissue with signals that support cell proliferation and organ formation. In other species, regeneration is less dependent on it. So the saddle is a useful landmark, not an on-off switch shared by every earthworm. There is also a basic direction problem. Rebuilding a tail means extending a repeated pattern. More intestine, more blood vessels, more nerve cord, more muscles, more segments, and finally an anus. Rebuilding a head requires several specialized structures to appear in the correct positions and connect to the remaining body. That does not make head regeneration impossible in all annelids. It makes it a much harder job, and many earthworm species have limited or lost that ability. A bucket of compost worms can make the myth even more confusing. Someone chops one accidentally, returns later, and sees plenty of healthy worms. It feels as if the halves recovered. More likely, the surviving front fragment disappeared into the bedding while the rear fragment died and decomposed, or the observer simply saw other worms. In a crowded worm bin, individual identity is not easy to track. So what should you do when you injure one while digging? Do not test the myth by cutting it again. Place any substantial front fragment gently into cool, loose, moist soil and cover it so it is protected from sun and drying. Avoid flooding it. There is no home surgery that can reattach the pieces, and handling them repeatedly only adds stress and surface damage. The old story contains one grain of truth. Earthworms can regenerate. It just turns a limited, species-dependent repairability into a superpower. A worm cut in half does not normally become twins. The front portion may rebuild a missing tail if the cut leaves enough healthy tissue and the right organs. The rear portion usually cannot replace everything it lost. And when the injury is crushing, contaminated, badly placed, or followed by drying, neither fragment may make it. Two moving pieces are not two surviving animals. They are two injured fragments facing very different biological odds.
Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. See you in the next one!